So I'm here today with Dominic Wells. He's the CEO and founder of Onfolio, and they're also acquiring companies. And so I have a shit ton of questions for Dom. And Dom, do you want to just give us kind of a high-level overview of Onfolio and what you guys do over there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, essentially we're a holding company. We buy online businesses. We're kind of following the Berkshire Hathaway model in the sense that we're looking for long-term holds, looking for sort of permanent capital, as opposed to, there's a lot of funds in the space where it's more like buy a business, grow it, flip it, and rinse and repeat, which isn't our model. We started out really just trying to focus on buying content websites, but we think that space is kind of flimsy these days, and we see a lot of opportunity in e-commerce and sometimes SaaS. So we actually really are kind of agnostic to the business model now. So again, there's other people in the space who are doing like an FBA roll-up or a Shopify roll-up, whereas we're, I guess, a bit more slutty than that. We kind of go for everything.
I'm the same. We have been the same way. Picking a thesis, or I mean, even a market, turns out it's really hard to do. We picked like no-code tools as our beginning, like, yay, we'll buy a bunch of no-code tools. And then you go try and find a bunch to go buy, and there's like two, you know what I mean? And like one's too small and one's too big, and you're like, oh shit, I guess we got to change markets. But I'd love to learn how you guys are, like, how is the company structured? Is it as a holding company, you guys are just an LLC with each individual company is an additional LLC underneath it, or is it all kind of under one company itself?
It's a mix. So we're actually a C Corp. When we first started, we were just Onfolio LLC, and we were a little bit of a service provider. So I had a few websites of my own, but we basically worked with investors who someone would say, hey, I want to buy a website off like Empire Flippers or something. Can you run it for me? And so we just did everything through Onfolio LLC, and they would buy the website in their own entity and just pay us a fee. But then we said, actually, we want to change to a holding company. We want to raise money into the holding company and eventually take it public. And so a C Corp was the way to go for that. And so we got the C Corp as the holding company. That's Onfolio Holdings Inc. We still have Onfolio LLC below, which is like the operating entity. And then if we buy a kind of small like affiliate SEO website, we'll probably just keep that under the operating LLC. But increasingly, as we're buying e-commerce or SaaS, typically they need to have their own PayPal accounts, their own Stripe accounts. The books get messy if they're all thrown into one. So we typically spin up another LLC, and then, yeah, that's just like the subsidiary underneath.
Where are you based out of, by the way?
I'm in Taiwan. The team is all over, really. We've got a team of about 5 in Taiwan with me, who are actually all Americans and a couple of Brits and 1 Canadian. And then the company is based out of Delaware. And then we have our COOs in New Zealand. She didn't really plan to be in New Zealand, but she's from there. And then when the pandemic started, she just, everybody kind of went home. We have people in Europe, people who are a bit more nomadic. So yeah, we're kind of remote, well, fully remote. We were like scratching our heads when the world started going remote first, because we were like, oh, we kind of like, isn't that how you run business? Like, we've always been like that. So kind of funny.
Have you ever considered using a series LLC for each additional acquisition that you guys do?
Yeah, I mean, not at the moment. We're kind of figuring things out with our legals and our books to be like, what should we do every time we buy? Should we follow a certain thing, or should we just do it as necessitates? And at the moment, we've just spun up an LLC as necessitates. But yeah, I think we need to look at some of the other options as well, so that we have something more robust, like more easy to follow.
And something I've been batting around too for us, where we bought 3 with just our own cash, and obviously that has limitations. Um, we've been deciding whether to go A, raise a fund, B, continue to do kind of like a sponsored deals where it's just kind of a deal by deal basis, spin up an LLC, we find a target, right? We put the investors in that LLC and we are the kind of like managing member of that LLC. So we control it, but other investors have shares in it. But you guys kind of went like a third way, which I haven't really given much thought to, which is almost at, I know obviously these aren't proper funds, but the terminology still holds. At the GP level, you guys sold like GP shares with the outcome of trying to eventually go public, which I think is awesome. Like I have similar aspirations. But how was that decision process to actually raise money at the GP level instead of doing like a deal by deal basis or just raising a more traditional fund?
Yeah, I wrote pages and pages in a notebook. I like read a lot of, if you Google anything like fund versus holding company, I've probably read the first 2 pages of Google. You know, there's a good article by like The Balance, for example. It was really a response to how I wanted to, like all the different boxes I wanted to tick. So at the time, like I mentioned, we were working with individuals. We had about 30 or 40 websites that we were operating. And whenever there was a Google update, most of the websites would be fine. 1 or 2 websites would get destroyed by the update. So as a whole, we were like, yeah, this is a good business model. But if you're the individual owner of one of those websites, like you've just bought a business for like 100K, 500K, and it's being wiped out. So not good. So we needed to think, okay, how can we have everyone owning a share of the same pie so that this isn't a problem anymore? And we looked at a few options. One was a fund. One was doing individual, like we played around with doing individual group buys. So say like 5 investors, 10 investors would pool money together and we'd buy one business and then we'd do it again. And the idea would be each one would go, instead of like putting all their money in one, they'd put like, 10K in one, 10K in another, 20K in a third. And that was okay, but it didn't really solve the problem of everyone owning the same pie, because it was down to the investors' discretion, and some of them only invested in one, so it had the same problem. And it was also a bit of a logistical nightmare. So it kind of came down to, do we go with a holding company or a fund? And I got pretty far along the fund route. Like I put a deck together, I had a lawyer ready, but it didn't quite sit right with me because I actually think a fund is quite rigid. Like I didn't want to just say, okay, we're going to buy these types of businesses, and then you buy them, and then in 5 years you have to sell them. I really liked the idea of a holding company, but a private holding company, the problems I saw was if you want to raise additional capital into the private holding company, you either have to do these continual kind of raises like companies like Thrasio do, and it's like, how do I value this? How do previous investors exit if they want to? Or what a lot of holding companies do is every time they raise money, they spin up a new LLC, new money comes into that, and then you end up with a whole bunch of different pies again instead of everyone owning the share of one. And I also had a lot of investors who were not accredited, because I've been around for a couple of years and I had people that maybe had like 300K that they could invest, but they weren't accredited. So they weren't poor by any means, but they just couldn't participate if we stayed private. And so I realized that when I looked at companies like Berkshire, I realized, well, they've got an added advantage because they're public. People can just buy and sell their shares. So there's liquidity. Because the feedback I got from a lot of investors is a lot of investors just hate locking up their money for like 5 years or 10 years indefinitely. And the sort of conclusion is, I found out that if we went public sooner rather than later, so rather than trying to get big, be $1 billion company and then go public, we're just going to go public when we're actually quite small. That's an acceptable path. It's a bit of a weird one, and a lot of people are like, why are you doing that? But for me, I was like, oh, that's actually, like, why would I not do that? Like, that solves all the problems I was trying to solve. And it allows us to go public sooner and get a bigger valuation sooner. Because when you're public, you get this arbitrage where you can buy businesses for, say, 4x as a private company. But as a public company, you'll probably be trading anywhere from like 10 to 20x. And so every time you buy a business, even if you don't grow it, like you're getting a better valuation your own end. And there's probably a lot more nuances, a lot more considerations that I've forgotten along the way. But that was kind of the evolution of my thought process when I sort of came up with this.
Yeah, and I've even seen too when public companies even just announce an acquisition and that gets priced in, oftentimes that increase in stock price makes up for the acquisition amount and then some, right? And then ideally it persists.
And sometimes they just pay with shares. Like I think when Disney bought Pixar, they didn't pay any cash. They just issued shares.
Right.
And when you do that, that often initially drops the share price because it's like printing money. Suddenly there's more shares, so the price of one share drops. But then once the earnings of that new business start showing up on income reports, then the share price can go up like quite significantly.
So how would the mechanism of going public work? Have you looked into like, I don't know, mating with a SPAC, or would you just do like a direct listing? Because I was just looking on the site and you guys have, if I recall, like 38 sites, right? And it's 4 point some odd million. So roughly like 100 grand per site ish. Doesn't it cost like close to at least $1 million just in, I don't know, for US based businesses, just in the like legal accounting and reporting and requirements and stuff like that to go public?
No, I mean, you can do it for about 200K if you do a direct listing. We also, one of our benefits is that we gave equity to someone who's taken like a dozen companies public before through a direct listing. So that drops a lot of the cost. A lot of people will go with a company that charges 100K just to put a PPM together, whereas he did it for free, basically, because we have equity. And then, so yeah, we're able to do it for a lot cheaper. But also a direct listing is fairly cheap. We looked at a SPAC as well, but again, we kind of started down the direct listing path before SPACs became super, flavor of the month. But no, it's probably going to cost us, in terms of the audit, the listing fee on the exchange, the filings, it will probably cost us about 250K to go public, and then around a similar amount to stay public every year. Probably a bit less, actually. Well, it actually depends, because we might go public in Canada on the CSE, and CSE actually has a cheaper, it costs more to go public on CSE, but it costs less to stay public. But we think we'll probably only be on CSE for like 2 years, and then we'll uplist to NASDAQ anyway. And then obviously the costs are a lot more, but by then we'll be larger. And so our logic is the cost of going public early is more than made up for by the benefits of being public early. And then when you get on NASDAQ, yeah, it's expensive. You need to be a large company, but we'll have reached that stage faster by being public earlier. So yeah, that's kind of the logic behind it. Like, being public is going to allow us to raise so much more capital so much faster, that like we have people who are like, I'm ready to give you a check for 500K, but I'm not going to do it until you're public, because I want to see, I want to know your financials are legit. I want to know that the SEC, or if it's in Canada, the Canadian equivalent, that you're compliant with them. And as soon as I see that, like, here's the money. And so one or two deals and our increased ability to raise money will more than make up for the costs and the hassle.
And going on the US stock exchange would be too expensive to start with?
Actually, no. So the original path was OTCQB, or one of the OTC ones. It depends. They're all kind of similar. OTCQB's got more prestige, but OTC Link is fine as well. But the reason we looked at Canada was because when you're on OTC, it's still a bit of a pain in the ass for investors to try and sell their shares if they want to, because they have to go through an exchange agent, a transfer agent, and then they have to load their share certificates into a brokerage that deals with OTC, and not all of them do. Whereas CSE, oh yeah, there's also a lockup period of like 6 months if an American buys shares, or 4 months if a non-American buys shares. Whereas CSE, there's no lockup period if you're a domestic, if you're a offshore entity. There's it's a lot easier for investors to like just load their shares into something like a Fidelity account, or they can just open like a Fidelity Canada account or something. So it's a lot easier for investors. There's a shorter lockup period, which again is easier for investors. So we could buy someone's business and give them shares, and they could sell the shares almost immediately if they wanted to. Now, we wouldn't want them to, so we would probably enforce a lockup period, but like there's no restrictions there. And there's also a kind of what's impressive factor as well. So right now we're probably on course for about 3 million revenue right now. And obviously that's increasing. Like by the end of the year, maybe it'll be like 500,000 a month, which is still quite small. Now, if you're in Canada and you go, oh, we've grown from like 1 million to 5 million revenue in a year, and then in the next year you go from 5 million to 10 million, that's actually quite impressive in Canada. So you might get a better valuation, you'll get more attention. Whereas in the US, that's kind of tiny and no one really cares. And so there's a few benefits to Canada. Now, some people might say, well, being public in the US is more prestigious than Canada, which is true. But that's why we're going to go to NASDAQ later. And so really, for all intents and purposes of going public, it doesn't matter if we're in Canada or the US, because people can still see our financial statements. There'll be IFRS instead of GAAP, but that doesn't matter. They can see that we're compliant with the Canadian government. We might even still do a dual listing and be on OTC if we find a lot of American investors are put off by Canada. I don't see why they would be, but you never know. And yeah, we'll be publishing quarterly financials. So all of the benefits will still be there. It's just a little bit easier. The SEC is a lot harder but they're both equally hard to comply with. So that's fine. But the SEC is just a lot more paperwork. So it's generally once you're on the CSE, it's a lot easier to stay you have slightly better deadlines with your filings, and you have slightly better costs and everything. And so, yeah, we just figured, let's go to Canada, and then either way, jumping from OTC to NASDAQ or Canada to NASDAQ's pretty similar. You just got to fill out the necessary forms and then job done. So yeah, to be honest, we have flip-flopped around this for a while. But yeah, this is the path that we feel pretty happy with right now.
Did you ever think about or consider the possibility of somebody buying the holding company as a whole and just sell that whole thing to private equity? Have you had any conversations like that?
No, we haven't been approached either, so we haven't had to have that conversation. But yeah, I mean, that is an option. I think we're just trying to swing slightly bigger than that. You know, who knows, maybe in a few years, if we're public and a company comes along and makes us an offer that's fantastic for our shareholders, we might consider that. But I'm sort of thinking in like 5, 10, 15-year time slots. And so I'm trying to build something significantly larger than that. So yeah, it's not sort of one of my exit plans, but I wouldn't rule it out.
That's super cool. My wheels are spinning on the public side of things, but I want to bounce back to just the cash flow side of actually running these things. So we do SaaS only, just because that's the only thing I know. And what we found initially, we were like, okay, we're going to buy these things, we're going to hold them forever. It's software. You know, we're going to buy perennial businesses and grow them into perpetuity. And Well, we found, I mean, obviously the deals that we're doing are quite small, but there's actually not enough cash flow, meaningful cash flow to pay back investors with. Do you guys, is it the nature of content sites that makes, I mean, SaaS in theory has, 80% gross margins, right? Maybe 90 if you're lucky, whatever. But in practice, it's like, you got to pay people. We got to pay engineers, right? Product design, growth stuff, I guess we both have to pay for in some way. But what made you decide to hold them forever? And how did you kind of overcome that initial cash flow problem that we have? Or maybe it's just us that we're fucking something up that we need to figure out quickly.
Well, part of the reason I want to hold them forever is because it's like a snowball thing. So at the lower end, yeah, there are cash flow issues, especially as when we were really small, like, we might have a business, let's say we had 5 websites that were producing, I don't know, $5,000 each a month profit, or $2,000 each a month profit. So that whole cluster of 5 sites makes 10 grand. But 5 sites, who's going to run them? So you hire someone to run them. Maybe that person costs you 5K. So now like half the profit's gone, and then you do it again, and it's just, but then eventually you need to start hiring 2 people to run 3 businesses and stuff. And so it is a bit of a cash flow drain. So we raised money. I think we raised about 800K. We got rid of a lot of our smaller sites, sold them off, and then we used a lot of that working capital to hire people and to buy bigger sites. So actually the economies of scale work really well. And also bigger businesses tend to come with teams. So if you buy a business and it might be the same in SaaS, like a lot of SaaS businesses at the smaller range tend to be sold by founders, and the founders doing all the work themselves because they're an engineer. And so maybe the business is making like, 5K a month, and the founder's like, I'm going to bounce after the sale. And so you have to bring in with your developer, and your developer costs more than the business is doing. But at a larger scale, like let's say, well, I haven't looked at a ton of SaaS, but if it's the same as content and ecom at a larger scale, that P&L tends to include team members in it, and there's no real additional replacement costs. Maybe there's some, but what we're able to do is I've got someone whose salary is paid for because he's running 3 businesses. Maybe he can now run a 4th, or we can hire someone else to run one, and they start running that business, but maybe they have capacity to run a second one. So it scales a lot better. The reason we want to hold them forever is because it's quite hard to find good businesses. So it's, you don't want to have to sell them after a few years, and rinse and repeat. And then, we saw a SaaS business the other day that was still sold by a single founder, but it was sold for like $30 million, and it was doing, I don't know, it was a high multiple, but I would have thought that SaaS was churning off quite a lot of cash flow. And then the other thing is we don't pay investors, because investors will be able to buy their shares and sell them in the future. We're not paying out dividends to our investors. We have a second share class that does come with dividends actually, but that's just like a slightly different conversation. But we're not obliged to pay out dividends to our investors from the profit of the business, so we can keep like cycling the cash back into additional acquisitions or growth things.
Right. So at the moment, your investors, I mean, you guys are, their exit is going to be you guys executing on this going public strategy, right? Because otherwise, for most investors outside of that other class of shares, they don't really get a dividend. They have ownership, but it's illiquid. Others I've seen, like for example, they pay, they kick off a dividend. So they buy software, they buy SaaS companies, and they say, we're going to give investors some, kind of profit share. And, they send monthly mailbox money. But you're right, at higher scales, like, I mean, obviously complexity increases, comes with its own kinds of problems, like the bigger you get. But broadly, the cash flow problems are a little bit easier because at the moment, each individual company that we have is too small to support like a developer or 2 each. So, but in aggregate, they can, right? But I'm curious
Yeah.
about your back of office setup. I mean, for us, the way I think about it is there's going to be engineering. There's no two ways about that. We're going to have engineers on staff. If we continue to buy these small little things and do a bunch of them, then we need kind of like a shared resource model. The obvious answer is like you said, where you go and you just kind of buy bigger businesses that can support a team by itself. And my only concern there is that there's a lot of people thinking that way, and I'm just trying to see, is there an angle for us to be kind of the go-to place where people can sell, a SaaS business that's under 10K with no employees, for example, and we have the infrastructure and the back end to go and operate those effectively. But I'd love to hear how you're thinking about operations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can do that because I don't know what your, how many businesses a developer can run before you need to hire another developer and so on. But potentially, what, and again, this is another reason why I thought, well, I don't want to do a fund, I want to do a holding company, is because I saw that really the best way to make this work is scale. What we're doing is, there's kind of two ways of doing it, really. There's like the highly centralized model, which is what, say, General Electric did. It's what a lot of the conglomerates did in the 70s. And that's actually what undid a lot of those conglomerates. Most of them were like, these guys were like, they were in Korea or they were in World War II. So they were very military and they were used to a very centralized model. So they just set up their conglomerates that way. But then businesses like Constellation Software, Berkshire Hathaway, they're all pretty decentralized. The only real centralized decision making is capital allocation. And even Constellation Software has pushed a lot of that down to the lower levels as well. And so we kind of have a little bit of both, to be honest with you. So we might buy a business and install someone as the CEO and be like, okay, you're going to run it. If you need to hire a marketing person and there's a budget, go hire a marketing person, and we're going to sort of leave you to run the business. But we actually have a central marketing department, and we have a central SEO department where it's not as efficient to have an individual SEO working on every individual business. So we have like a team of like 4 SEOs who will work on every business. And marketing, again, there's like 3 or 4 people who will do marketing for not every business, but the ones that need marketing. And it's probably going to go that way when we build out a media buying arm as well. Right now, right now we just use agencies for our media buying. And then we've got me as the CEO, and we've got a COO who oversees everything. And then we have kind of portfolio managers who are like mini CEOs, but they run maybe 4 or 5 businesses. It depends on the business and their skills and things like that. Because there are 2 ways to do it, particularly with content in e-commerce businesses. It's like, do we have one team that works on everything, or do we have one team for everything? And what we've found is it's kind of a hybrid approach. I would like to go more decentralized, and I think it's a cost thing. And if a business gets really big, maybe it just gets its own team. And then the smaller ones, you have this kind of fractional sharing of resources. So it's cheaper to have central and one team running everything, but they get spread too thin. And so the performance actually benefits from focus. And so decentralization, I think, is better. And I have to make fewer decisions and hold fewer business plans in my head. So it's nice for me as well.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Do you feel like using international labor really makes this business model work? Because the reason I asked that question is because we can only afford non-US based labor, right? Like
Right.
even Europe's too expensive, right? We're going to Brazil, we're going to Colombia, Mexico, right? Africa, India, China. That's where we can source talent from, because that is our price point at the moment.
Yeah.
But it actually makes our margins obviously a lot better. Do you feel like this I don't know, whatever it is that we're doing is really enabled by using a global talent pool?
I think it can be, yeah. I think so. When we started out, and I had a previous service-based business which had smaller margins, and so we had a lot of Filipinos, a lot of South Africans are pretty good because they're basically Westerners, but for like Eastern European prices, or previous Eastern European prices, because Eastern Europe's actually getting more expensive now. And again, we also have some Eastern Europeans. I find as we're getting bigger, I'm hiring more North Americans because even though they're expensive, and you also have things like health insurance, you have to have them as employees and not contractors. I just find North Americans tend to be, there's a bigger pool of really talented people. And so I could hire like a Serbian for 3K, or I could hire an American, let's say for 7K. Or, obviously some like engineers, American engineers are probably what, 12K, 15K, but like good marketing people maybe are 7K. But that 7K person isn't twice as good as the 3K person. They're often 5, 6, 7 times as good. So in terms of bang for buck, actually, the more expensive people are actually better. But for the menial jobs, like the virtual assistant type work, yeah, like you can absolutely use remote positions. I actually haven't had any experience hiring from like Brazil or China, India. Yeah, there's a lot of good labor out there. There's also a lot of bad labor. So my experience has always been Filipinos and Eastern Europeans, and it depends on the role. Like Filipinos are really good at some things, Eastern Europeans are really good at some things. But yeah, I think it can definitely enable a lot of making the model work, particularly when the margins are lower. I just went, you know what, how can I make it so that the margins are better? I was like, oh, raise money, buy bigger businesses, and then I can hire more expensive people. That's way easier. Just hiring people who are better at my job than I am. That's the dream.
Yeah. And then I know we're well over time, but I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on the transition from buying content businesses to buying e-commerce businesses. And then the obvious question for me as a kind of SaaS person, why not SaaS?
Yeah, so why not SaaS? Actually, we've looked at a couple of SaaS. There's one I looked at shortly before this call, which we may explore further. The main reason was initially we didn't have a developer on the team. And again, like I mentioned, a lot of these SaaS businesses are sold by founders. And it's like, okay, I'm going to need to pay all the profit out of the business to replace you. So it's kind of annoying when it's like, how much is this business doing? Like, oh, 500K revenue. What's the profit? 200K. How much do you pay yourself? Like nothing. So the profit's basically nothing if I replace you then. But now we have a developer on our team who, his salary is already accounted for. He can A, help us vet the SaaS, and B, like tell us whether he can run it, and C, like, oh no, we're going to need an engineer to do these elements and stuff. So SaaS has come into play for us now. E-commerce was, I always wanted to get into e-commerce, and my head of SEO had a lot of experience with e-commerce, so he wanted to get into it. I just didn't want to spend investors' money on an experiment. Like, what if I buy an e-commerce and it dies? But we basically accidentally bought an e-commerce business because I hired someone away from an e-commerce business, and when he told his boss that he was leaving, his boss was like, "Oh, I want to retire, so maybe you guys can just buy the business." And we got it for basically no money down. We're just paying for the business over time.
Great.
And yeah, I'm loving it. We've grown it quite significantly. There's so many levers you can pull compared to content websites. Like it's harder, and it's a much bigger cash flow sink than a content site. But there's also a lot of funding available for e-commerce businesses, like Shopify Capital, for example. So you can get some cash to purchase inventory with quite easily.
Do you guys take on debt?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on the cost of capital. There's some pretty attractive options out there and some pretty unattractive options. But yeah, we're not afraid of that, like within reason, obviously. But things like Shopify Capital helped us out because when we bought the business, we got it for no money down, and then we had to at the time basically all of the profit was going back to paying the seller, and then we needed to make like 100 grand inventory purchase, and Shopify Capital were like, well, we'll give you 60. And so we took 60, we put in 50 of our own, bought the inventory, and we've already, I think we've basically just paid off Shopify in like 6 months, and we've grown quite significantly. So it was worth it for us.
Growth, I think, is
yeah.
most of the answer to all of these problems, questions. Cash flow problems, just grow. Oh, you made a shitty purchase, it was too expensive. Well, we'll just grow into that valuation. But
Yeah.
one of the things I find difficult to wrap my head around is when you guys are buying stuff like forever. How do you get rid, like, so here's the context. I'm battling with the idea that our business models are subject to power laws, right? Like naturally in a portfolio of X companies, you're going to have some that just win or some that just catch, right? And naturally you're going to have some that like just kind of suck, or like, it's, every dollar you put in, you only get 50 cents back no matter what you do. How do you think about like selling off the losers and kind of doubling down on the winners, or using that cash to buy new ones if you guys are trying to hold them forever?
Yeah, I mean, we'll do that. Like one of the first things we did when we raised money was we sold off a bunch of our smaller sites that just don't make sense to hold. And if we bought a business and it didn't work out, yeah, we would still sell it. So it's not a hard and fast rule of we won't sell. It's more of a mindset. If you're thinking about buying businesses and holding them forever, you look at businesses a lot differently. You're not trying to find, like if you're a flipping business, you might try and find something that's kind of crap and be like, oh, I can flip this. Whereas we're like, I mean, yeah, we'll still take a flipping opportunity if we see one, but we're more approaching businesses like, could we hold this one forever? And when you ask yourself that, you tend to do due diligence a lot differently, and you tend to be fussier, which is generally a good thing, particularly in this market.
What
But yeah,
time
like
frame do you consider it to be a flip? Is it a year hold, 6-month hold, 2 years?
I mean, I guess I would consider a flip to be, yeah, around that mark, like maybe 6 months, maybe 18 months or 2 years. But it is interesting because let's say we buy a business and we grow it and it's doing really well, and we think we can't grow it anymore, and we've doubled the money we deployed. So potentially we could sell it, take a tax hit, but then we're going to end up with more money to buy another business which has growth potential. So we could do that, or we could just hold it forever and just cash flow it and just do like maintenance and then take that cash into another business. So then the decision is like, okay, if we can't grow it anymore, how risky is it to hold? Like if we hold it and just do the bare minimum, is it gonna eventually die? Like, should we sell it now while it's going well, give it to someone else who can focus on it? Or can we just leave it to just chug along and do its own thing and pour off cash? And so it kind of depends on how confident we are with that. Yeah, so really, those are the considerations. Now, if we think we can't grow it anymore, we don't want to deploy any additional cash into it because we just get bad ROI, but we don't want to hold it because if we do nothing with it for 6 months, eventually it's going to like just die. Then yeah, we'll sell it. And then, but the idea is it's more of a mindset thing. So if we tell people we're flipping businesses, they come in to invest and they're like, oh, so you're gonna, when you sell these businesses, are you going to share the proceeds with us? And we're like, no, we're doing like a permanent capital. We just keep rolling the money up. It's much more tax efficient for everybody as well. But
Why is it
we're not going to rule out
efficient?
selling it.
if you guys, so when you sell us, if you create a software company and you go to sell it, generally speaking, that's not capital. Generally, right? I mean, this isn't tax advice, blah, blah, blah. But if you buy a SaaS company, it is capital, right? You can depreciate that. And then when you sell it, it's also capital. But why is it more tax efficient if you sell it and roll it up versus sell it and distribute it? Particularly in an LLC. Well, C Corp too. I mean, well, the C Corp, I guess you're just paying corporate tax. And then you would have to pay the double hit if you dispersed it. Is that what you mean by more tax efficient?
Yeah, I was thinking more like we get the ROI within just by keeping the cash within the business and growing it and growing it and growing it. And then when a seller sells his shares, like he just gets that tax hit once rather than every time we sell a business. But I probably don't know enough details about that to try and answer it. But just my understanding is that it's better to just keep maybe I'm confusing selling a business with not selling one, but essentially paying dividends out, for example, versus just redeploying that capital over a long period and then investors sell their shares at the end of it. That's more tax efficient. But in terms of selling businesses, I'm not actually sure the finer details. So I may have answered that bit wrong. Yeah, I mean, there's just many other reasons why we don't want to have that like flip mindset. Yeah, it's just generally how we're approaching it. But that, again, if we see a business that we're like, you know what, we should just sell this one, then we will. So it's not against the rules or anything.
Perfect. Well, Tom, I really appreciate your time. This has been tremendously helpful for me. I think I extracted a lot of really useful things and confirmed some thoughts that I had about our next moves and such. So I really appreciate you being open and, best of luck going public. That's so cool.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a good chat. I like the structure of this podcast. It's just kind of like grab a coffee and chat about stuff. So I appreciate you inviting me on.
Right on. Well, take care. Where can people find you? Or are you not that kind of guy?
No, unfortunately I am. I'm pretty responsive. Yeah, so obviously the website is onfolio.co. And I think we found each other on Twitter. So Twitter's always a good place to approach me. I'm at Team Onfolio. But yeah, if anyone goes to the website, fills out the contact form, that'll find its way to me if anyone wants to chat as well. So either of those two things are a great place to find or follow me.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on.